The urgent call for help. The hospital was busy. It was a regular night shift at St. Andrew's Hospital, and the air was filled with the sound of phones ringing and nurses rushing between rooms. The waiting room was crowded with people, some sick, some scared, all waiting for their turn to see a doctor. But in the emergency room, everything changed when an urgent call came in. The dispatcher's voice was sharp and clear over the hospital's intercom. Car accident, multiple injuries, critical patient on the way. Immediate surgery required. Nurses and doctors instantly shifted their focus. The tension in the ER grew as the hospital team braced for the worst. Dr. Omar, one of the top surgeons at St. Andrews, was on duty that night. Known for his steady hands and quick thinking, he had saved countless lives in his career. He was a calm presence in the chaos, and his reputation as a lifesaver had earned him the respect of his colleagues. But tonight, something felt different. He stood by the operating table, ready for whatever the night would bring. His mind raced through the list of possible injuries the patient might have. A car accident could cause anything from broken bones to internal bleeding. The team was ready for anything. As the doors to the ER swung open, the stretcher was rolled in. The patient, a young man, was barely conscious. Blood covered his clothes, and his face was pale from shock. He had a deep gash on his forehead, and his breathing was shallow. His injuries were severe. It was clear that his life was in danger, but with quick action, Dr. Omar believed they could save him. Dr. Omar quickly assessed the situation. "Get a blood transfusion ready," he called out, his voice steady. "We need to stabilize him before we can operate. Prep the ore now." His team worked quickly, moving in unison, gathering the supplies they would need for the surgery. But just as Dr. Omar was about to head into the operating room, something unexpected happened. A hospital administrator, Mr. Green, appeared at his side. Mr. Green was known for his strict adherence to hospital policies. He had always followed the rules, no matter the situation. Tonight, however, his presence seemed to add to the tension that was already building. "Dr. Omar, I need to speak with you for a moment," Mr. Green said, his voice low and serious. Dr. Omar felt a chill run through him. He knew something was wrong. The administrator's tone wasn't one of concern, but one of authority. "I'm in the middle of something important," Dr. Omar replied, his eyes still on the patient. "We have a young man here who needs surgery now. I don't have time for a chat." Mr. Green's expression darkened. "I understand, Dr. Omar, but I've been given new instructions. You're not to perform the surgery on this patient." Dr. Omar's head snapped up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What? This is an emergency. The patient needs immediate surgery, or he will die." Mr. Green's face was unmoving. "I know, but the patient's family has made it clear that they don't want you in the OR. They've requested another surgeon." Dr. Omar blinked in disbelief. "What are you talking about? Why would they refuse my help?" The administrator looked away briefly before meeting Dr. Omar's gaze again. "It's a personal matter. The family has made certain demands, and we must respect their wishes." Dr. Omar couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was about a patient's life, a life that could slip away if surgery was delayed. But now, for reasons he couldn't understand, he was being told he couldn't help. His chest tightened with frustration. "Are you telling me that, despite my qualifications, I am being blocked from saving this man's life because of someone's personal bias?" Dr. Omar asked, his voice growing louder. Mr. Green shifted uncomfortably, but held his ground. "I'm just following orders, Dr. Omar. You are not to be involved in this surgery. We have a different surgeon who will handle it." Dr. Omar took a step back, his mind racing. He had never encountered a situation like this before. Racism in a hospital. The thought was almost too much to comprehend. But here it was, in front of him. His career, his duty to save lives, all dismissed because of someone's prejudice. "I can't let this happen," Dr. Omar muttered, mostly to himself. He turned back to the patient, who was now being prepped for surgery by other staff members. His heart pounded in his chest as he considered his next move. He was the best surgeon for the job, and he couldn't just walk away. The patient's life was on the line. He took a deep breath and made a decision. "I'll perform the surgery anyway," he said, his voice calm but filled with determination. Mr. Green's eyes widened in surprise. "You can't just ignore hospital policy, Dr. Omar. There will be consequences." Dr. Omar didn't answer. He walked past the administrator and into the operating room. He knew that the risks were high. If he was caught, it could cost him everything: his career, his reputation, even his freedom. But he couldn't stand by and let a life slip away just because of racism. As he scrubbed his hands and put on his surgical gloves, Dr. Omar took one final look at the young man on the table. The patient's life was in his hands. There was no turning back now. The surgery began, and Dr. Omar worked quickly, determined to save the young man. He could hear the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears as he focused on every movement, every incision. He had made his choice, and there was no going back. And so, the stage was set for a battle, not just for the patient's life, but for the truth, justice, and the fight against racism that no one expected. The rising tension. The tension in the operating room was suffocating. Dr. Omar had just made the bold decision to go ahead with the surgery, despite being told by the hospital administration to stay away. He knew the risks involved. If anyone found out, he could lose everything: his career, his reputation. But saving this young man's life was all that mattered now. The young patient, still unconscious, was lying on the operating table, his injuries more severe than anyone had anticipated. Blood was dripping from the gash on his forehead, and his breathing was labored. Dr. Omar had seen worse, but something about this situation felt different. The weight of the moment pressed on him. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. "Start the IV drip. I need to stabilize him before we can proceed," Dr. Omar instructed his team. His hands moved quickly but carefully as the team followed his lead. Nurses were assisting, checking the monitors, preparing for the next phase of the operation. Everyone in the room understood the gravity of the situation, and they all worked in sync, aware that their actions were about to save a life, or possibly cost it. Despite the professionalism in the room, Dr. Omar couldn't shake the thought that things weren't going to go as planned. The hospital administration had clearly stated that he wasn't welcome in the OR. There was no doubt in his mind that they would find out what he was doing. The only question was when. Outside the operating room, the hospital corridors were quiet. Mr. Green, the administrator who had forbidden Dr. Omar from performing the surgery, stood in a hallway, his hands clasped behind his back. He was angry, furious, in fact, that Dr. Omar had gone against his orders. He paced back and forth, trying to decide what to do next. He knew the surgeon was talented, but this was beyond insubordination. It was defiance. If Dr. Omar wasn't stopped, the hospital would face serious consequences. "You can't just ignore the rules, Omar," Mr. Green muttered to himself. He was trying to calm down, but the anger was bubbling inside him. "I'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed." Back in the operating room, Dr. Omar was focused entirely on the task at hand. The room was dimly lit except for the harsh overhead lights that illuminated the patient. The heart monitor beeped steadily, but the readings weren't ideal. The young man's vital signs were weak, and they needed to act fast. Dr. Omar looked at the clock on the wall. Every second that passed was another moment closer to losing the patient. He had no choice but to push forward. He quickly directed his team to prepare for the next stage of the surgery. "We need to stabilize his heart," he instructed. "I'm going to administer a drug to regulate his heartbeat. He's in shock, and we need to counter it." The nurses and anesthesiologists moved swiftly to follow his orders. Dr. Omar felt the weight of the decision press on his shoulders. This was not just any surgery. It was his reputation, his career, and most importantly, this patient's life that was on the line. He could hear the soft beeping of the monitors in the background, and his mind raced with the potential consequences of his actions. If this didn't work, the blame would fall squarely on him. Meanwhile, outside the operating room, the hospital was beginning to buzz with rumors. Some nurses had noticed that Dr. Omar wasn't following protocol. He was in the operating room, against orders. Whispers began to spread among the staff about what was really going on behind closed doors. Some were shocked, others skeptical, and some silently hoped that Dr. Omar would pull through and save the patient. They knew he was a skilled surgeon, but this was risky. In another part of the hospital, Dr. Omar's colleague, Dr. Lee, was in the break room, sipping her coffee, when she received a text from a nurse. It read, "Omar's in the OR, but he wasn't supposed to be. They stopped him from operating." Dr. Lee's heart skipped a beat. She knew Dr. Omar well. He was a man of integrity and excellence. There was no way he would go against hospital policy unless it was absolutely necessary. Without thinking twice, Dr. Lee stood up, grabbing her things. She knew she had to see for herself what was happening. The hospital administration might be trying to stop Dr. Omar, but she wasn't going to sit back and let it happen without knowing the truth. She quickly walked through the halls, her mind racing with questions. Why was Omar being stopped? Was it truly about hospital policy, or was there something more to it? As Dr. Lee made her way to the operating room, she ran into Mr. Green, the administrator who had blocked Dr. Omar's surgery. He was heading in the opposite direction, a stern look on his face. When he saw her, he quickly tried to avoid eye contact, but Dr. Lee wasn't having it. "What's going on, Mr. Green?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Why are you stopping Dr. Omar from operating on that patient?" Mr. Green's face flushed with anger, but he didn't answer. He simply shook his head and walked past her, as if ignoring her question. But Dr. Lee wasn't going to let it go. She turned to follow him, but before she could speak again, her phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the nurses inside the OR. "Omar's doing the surgery anyway. The patient's critical. No one knows what will happen next." Dr. Lee stood still for a moment. She had no doubt in her mind that Dr. Omar was risking everything for the patient. She knew she couldn't just stand by and watch. She had to help. It was time to make a choice. Would she follow the rules and report Dr. Omar, or would she join him and take a stand? The clock was ticking, and the decision would be made soon. Either way, the stakes were high, and everything was about to change. Inside the operating room, Dr. Omar's hands worked quickly, sweat trickling down his brow. He glanced at the clock again. There was no more time to waste. The unexpected intervention. Inside the operating room, Dr. Omar worked with a steady hand, his eyes focused on the patient lying before him. The young man's condition was worsening, and the pressure to save him was mounting with each passing second. As the clock ticked, the team worked in silence, each member fully aware of the gravity of the situation. The decision to continue the surgery had already been made, but there was still so much to do, and so little time. Dr. Omar's mind raced. What will happen if I fail? He couldn't afford to think about failure right now. The patient's life was hanging in the balance. He had to push through. His hands trembled slightly, but he steadied them. This was his moment, and he was going to give it everything he had. Outside the operating room, Dr. Lee's heart was pounding. She had just received the message from the nurse and had made a quick decision. She wasn't going to let Dr. Omar face this battle alone. He needed support, and she wasn't going to back down. She moved quickly down the sterile white corridors of the hospital, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Just as Dr. Lee reached the operating room door, she saw a figure approaching, Mr. Green. His face was red with anger, his expression rigid and determined. He was storming toward the door, clearly intent on stopping the surgery. Dr. Lee didn't hesitate. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Mr. Green, you can't stop this. The patient needs this surgery now," she said, her voice firm but calm. Mr. Green's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand, Dr. Lee. This is against the rules. We have protocols for a reason." "But this isn't about protocols, is it?" Dr. Lee's voice sharpened. "It's about saving a life. Dr. Omar is the best surgeon for this job. You're putting your pride and rules above that. Is that what you really want to do?" For a moment, Mr. Green said nothing. He stood there, his face a mix of anger and frustration. But Dr. Lee didn't back down. She knew that in times like this, the rules were meant to serve the people, not the other way around. She was about to speak again when she saw movement inside the operating room. It was Dr. Omar. He was still at work, determined and resolute. Without warning, Mr. Green pushed past Dr. Lee and barged into the room. His voice rang out. "Dr. Omar, you need to stop this surgery right now." Dr. Omar didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. His focus was entirely on the young patient in front of him. The young man's vitals were becoming erratic, and every second counted. There was no time to argue, no time for distractions. But Mr. Green wasn't about to let it go. "I said, stop the surgery," Mr. Green shouted, his voice filled with authority. "This is unacceptable." Dr. Omar took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't about to let Mr. Green's words distract him. "I'm not stopping. This patient's life is on the line," he said calmly, almost too calmly, as he worked to stabilize the patient's breathing. The tension in the room was palpable. The nurses looked at each other, unsure of what to do. They had all been briefed on the situation, but now that Mr. Green was in the room, things were becoming more complicated. "You're risking your career, Omar," Mr. Green warned, his voice low but filled with anger. "You don't want to cross me." But Dr. Omar wasn't listening. The patient's condition was deteriorating, and he had no choice but to continue. He couldn't allow fear of losing his job or his reputation to cloud his judgment. He had sworn an oath to save lives, and that was what mattered now. Suddenly, the door to the operating room burst open again, and Dr. Lee stepped inside, her presence commanding attention. She walked toward Dr. Omar, her face calm but determined. "I'm staying," she said, her voice steady, "and I'm helping." Dr. Omar didn't need to say a word. His eyes met hers, and without a second thought, they both returned to work, their focus solely on the patient. Together, they were a team. No matter what Mr. Green or the hospital administration said, they would save this life. Mr. Green was left standing by the door, fuming with rage. His control was slipping, and the anger in his chest was building to a boiling point. "You're making a huge mistake, both of you," he muttered under his breath, but he made no move to stop them. As Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee continued their work, the tension in the room only seemed to increase. The patient's heart rate was beginning to stabilize, but the fight was far from over. Dr. Lee's hands were steady as she assisted Dr. Omar, handing him the instruments he needed. The sound of the beeping monitors was almost deafening, each beep marking a second of precious time. Outside the operating room, the news was beginning to spread. Staff members whispered to each other, rumors swirling about the defiant surgery being performed against the hospital's orders. Some supported Dr. Omar, believing in his skill and dedication to saving lives, while others were angry, thinking he had overstepped his boundaries. But no one could deny one thing. Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee were fighting for something much bigger than their careers. They were fighting for the life of an innocent person. The question on everyone's mind now was simple. Would Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee be able to save this patient, or would their defiance come at a great cost? And even more importantly, what would happen when the hospital administration found out the truth? The outcome of this surgery was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The situation was spiraling out of control, and no one could predict what would happen next. The battle for justice. Inside the operating room, the air was thick with tension. Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee worked in perfect synchrony, the hum of the monitors and the sound of their instruments filling the room. The young patient's condition was improving, but there was still a long way to go. Every move was crucial. They both knew that saving this life was far from guaranteed, but giving up was not an option. Despite the pressure, Dr. Omar remained calm, his hand steady as he focused on the surgery. He wasn't just fighting to save a life. He was fighting against a system that was trying to take away his right to do his job. The sense of injustice weighed heavily on him. How could the hospital stop him from helping a patient just because of his race? It was a question that haunted him, one he could not shake. Outside the operating room, the hospital administration was in full panic mode. Word had spread that Dr. Omar was continuing the surgery despite orders to stop. Mr. Green's angry report had already reached the higher-ups, and now they were scrambling to contain the situation. They had no idea how to handle a surgeon who was defying direct orders, and the growing backlash was starting to look like it might escalate into something much bigger than they anticipated. In the hallway, Dr. Lee stood by the door of the operating room, talking to one of the nurses. The nurse's face was filled with concern as she quietly relayed information. "Dr. Lee, the hospital board is furious. They're demanding that Dr. Omar be suspended immediately after the surgery." Dr. Lee's expression hardened. She had expected this. The hospital had always been about preserving its reputation, not about the welfare of its patients. "We're doing the right thing," she said, her voice firm. "No matter what they say, we have to finish this." "I know," the nurse replied. "But I'm scared, Dr. Lee. What if they come after both of you? What if this costs you your jobs?" Dr. Lee paused, her hand resting on the doorframe, as she thought for a moment. She had made peace with the fact that she might lose everything, but the life of this patient mattered more than her career. "If it costs us everything, then so be it. We can't let this man die just because of our cowardice." Inside the operating room, Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee were not only fighting to save the young man's life, they were battling the dark undercurrent of racism that had infected the very system they worked for. Dr. Omar's mind raced as he worked, but every time he thought about the injustice they were facing, his determination grew stronger. He couldn't back down now. He had to keep going, no matter what. Back in the hospital's boardroom, Mr. Green stood with a group of administrators, his arms crossed as he angrily described what had happened. "This is an outright rebellion," he declared. "Dr. Omar is jeopardizing the hospital's reputation. We can't allow this behavior to continue." The head of the board, Ms. Williams, listened silently, her face a mask of concern. She understood the gravity of the situation, but even more so, she understood the pressure the hospital was under to protect its image. "We'll take immediate action once the surgery is over," she said coldly. "Dr. Omar will be removed from his position." But Mr. Green was not so sure. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like Dr. Omar wasn't just disobeying orders. He was making a statement, a bold challenge to the system that Mr. Green was so desperate to protect. "What if this backfires?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "What if the public finds out?" As the minutes passed, the tension outside the operating room mounted. It seemed like an eternity. Inside, Dr. Omar was finally nearing the most delicate part of the surgery. His movements were precise, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. The young man's vitals had stabilized, but there was still a lot of work to do. Dr. Omar knew that every second counted. Then, just as the procedure was reaching its final stages, the door to the operating room flew open once again. A new figure stepped inside. Dr. Chen, the chief of surgery, with an air of authority and determination. "Dr. Omar, you need to stop immediately," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. Dr. Omar looked up, his eyes narrowing in frustration. "No, I'm not stopping. This patient's life is worth more than your orders." Dr. Chen's face hardened. "You're going to regret this, Omar. You've made your choice, but this won't end well for you." The tension in the room was suffocating. The young patient's heart rate fluctuated, and Dr. Omar knew that every word he exchanged with Dr. Chen was one less second he could spend saving the patient. His response was short and firm. "I'm doing my job." Dr. Chen's jaw tightened, but he didn't say another word. Instead, he stood there, his arms crossed, watching as Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee finished the procedure. There was no more time to argue. The outcome of the surgery would determine everything. Outside the room, the clock continued to tick. The hospital's administration was preparing to take action, but Dr. Lee and Dr. Omar's defiance had sparked something they hadn't anticipated: a wave of support from the hospital staff. Nurses, other doctors, and even patients who had witnessed the events were beginning to speak out. The question now was, would Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee be able to save the patient, or would their rebellion cost them everything? As the final moments of the surgery approached, the hospital's future and the future of the patient hung in the balance. The unexpected outcome. As Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee worked together in the operating room, the minutes felt like hours. The pressure of the situation weighed heavily on both of them. They knew the stakes were high, not only for the young man's life, but for their careers. The hospital was watching closely, and any mistake could cost them everything. The young patient's heart rate had become erratic, sending waves of tension through the room. Dr. Omar's brow was furrowed in concentration as he adjusted the instruments, his hand steady despite the overwhelming pressure. He could feel the eyes of the entire hospital system bearing down on him. But all that mattered in this moment was the life on the operating table. "Just a few more minutes," Dr. Lee whispered, her voice calm but filled with urgency. She kept her eyes on the monitors, ready to assist at any moment. There was no room for error. Outside the operating room, the hospital was in chaos. The board had decided that once the surgery was over, they would take immediate action against Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee. They had defied hospital orders, and it was clear that the situation had spiraled beyond their control. The tension in the building was palpable, as employees and patients alike awaited the outcome of the surgery that would determine the fate of the hospital's two rebellious doctors. The minutes dragged on. Inside the operating room, Dr. Omar felt as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He could feel the patient's life hanging by a thread, and it was up to him to save him. He focused all his energy on the task, ignoring the looming consequences. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the patient's vitals began to stabilize. The heart rate slowed, and the blood pressure returned to normal. Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee exchanged a brief, relieved glance. It wasn't over yet, but they had done it. The patient's life was no longer in immediate danger. But as they began to close the incision, the door to the operating room suddenly burst open again. This time, it was the hospital's chief administrator, Ms. Williams, standing in the doorway. Her expression was cold, her eyes narrowed with authority. "Dr. Omar," she said sharply, "you've gone too far." Dr. Omar didn't look up from his work, his focus unwavering. "The patient is stable," he said quietly. "That's all that matters right now." Ms. Williams stepped further into the room, her heels clicking on the sterile floor. "You've disobeyed direct orders. We've already decided to take action against you. Your defiance will not go unpunished." Dr. Omar finally looked up at her, his eyes hard with resolve. "You can punish me all you want," he said calmly, "but I did my job. I saved a life. You can't take that away." Ms. Williams opened her mouth to respond, but Dr. Lee interrupted her, speaking up for the first time in the conversation. "It's not just Dr. Omar. We both took a stand. We did what was right, and we don't regret it." Ms. Williams hesitated, her gaze flickering between the two doctors. She had not expected such defiance, especially in such a tense moment. "You think this is over?" she asked, her voice a low growl. "You've created a public scandal. You'll both be removed from the hospital, and your careers will be ruined." Dr. Omar stood tall, his voice steady. "You can't take away what we've done here. The patient is alive because we did what we knew was right. The world is watching, and if you try to punish us, you'll be the ones who pay the price." The tension in the room was palpable. Ms. Williams stood there, unable to respond immediately. The weight of the situation seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the hospital on her, waiting for her next move. She knew that whatever happened next would have a huge impact, not just on the two doctors, but on the entire institution. As Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee finished their work, they knew that this was only the beginning. The patient was still in critical condition, and their actions had already set off a chain of events that would change everything. There was no turning back now. The outcome of this surgery had sparked something much bigger than just a medical procedure. It had sparked a fight for justice, a fight that could bring the whole hospital to its knees. As the doctors closed the patient's wounds and began the final steps of the surgery, Dr. Omar couldn't help but think about what lay ahead. The hospital board, the administration, and the media would all be waiting for the fallout. Would they stand by their decision to defy authority, or would they buckle under the pressure? The sound of the monitor beeped steadily, signaling that the young man's heart was still beating. Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee exchanged a silent nod of relief. They had done their job, but they knew that the real battle was just beginning. Would they be able to keep their jobs? Would the hospital's administration punish them for saving a life? And most importantly, would the patient survive this ordeal? As they finished the surgery and began the final steps of stabilization, the hospital's fate, and their own, remained uncertain. The unexpected outcome of their defiance had just begun to unfold. The fallout begins. The surgical team stepped out of the operating room, their faces tense but relieved. The patient, though still critical, had made it through the most dangerous part of the surgery. The machines beeped steadily in the background, signaling that for now, the young man was alive. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. However, as the door to the operating room closed behind Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee, the weight of their defiance began to settle in. The hospital was already buzzing with the news of what had happened. Dr. Omar's and Dr. Lee's actions had caused a ripple of shock that stretched far beyond the sterile walls of the operating room. Ms. Williams, the hospital's chief administrator, wasn't done. She had already called a meeting with the board, determined to make an example of the two doctors. She couldn't let them think they could break the rules and get away with it. The press had already caught wind of the story, and the media was circling like sharks. The hospital's reputation was on the line, and she would do whatever it took to protect it, even if it meant ruining the careers of two doctors who had just saved a life. Meanwhile, Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee were preparing themselves for the inevitable. They knew that the fallout from this decision would come fast and hard. There was no doubt in their minds that the hospital would try to punish them. They had acted against direct orders, and now they would have to pay the price. But neither of them had any regrets. "We did what was right," Dr. Omar said quietly as they walked down the hallway, the weight of their actions still hanging in the air. "We couldn't just stand by and let that man die." Dr. Lee nodded, her expression determined. No one should ever be put in that position. The hospital's policies might have been clear, but they were wrong. We knew we had to step in. They reached the staff lounge, where a few of their colleagues had gathered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. Some were supportive, nodding in agreement with Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee's actions. Others were more apprehensive, unsure of the consequences that lay ahead. "I'm proud of both of you," one of their colleagues, Dr. Harris, said, breaking the silence. "What you did was brave. But you know the hospital won't let this slide. You're both in trouble." "We know," Dr. Omar replied with a sigh. "But we couldn't just let a man die because of some hospital policy. Sometimes you have to do what's right, even if it costs you everything." Another doctor, Dr. Matthews, chimed in, his voice soft but laced with concern. "You might have saved the patient's life, but you've put your careers on the line. The board won't take this lightly. I'm just saying, you might want to prepare yourselves for what's coming." Dr. Lee frowned, but she stood tall, determined. "We've already made our peace with that. If it costs us our jobs, then so be it. But at least we know we did the right thing." As the conversation continued, Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of their control. The hospital was already making its moves, and it wouldn't be long before they were called into a meeting to face the consequences of their actions. The board had made it clear that they would not tolerate disobedience, and now, the doctors were waiting to see what the fallout would be. Later that day, the call came. Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee were summoned to the boardroom. The tension in the room was palpable as they entered. The board members sat at the long, polished table, their faces stern and unreadable. Ms. Williams was at the head of the table, her expression cold, though her eyes held a flicker of something. Whether it was anger, frustration, or something deeper, Dr. Omar couldn't tell. Dr. Omar, Dr. Lee, Ms. Williams began, her voice clipped and formal. You've put this hospital in a difficult position. Your actions today have been reckless, and the hospital cannot allow this to go unchecked. Dr. Omar straightened his back, meeting her gaze. We did what was right. We saved a life. You can't take that away from us. Ms. Williams' eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She glanced at the other board members, all of whom were silent, their faces unreadable. Finally, one of the board members, Dr. Davidson, spoke. You've both made a mockery of the hospital's policies. We are here to serve the patients, yes, but we also have rules in place for a reason. You've broken those rules, and now we have to decide what to do about it. Dr. Lee spoke up, her voice steady but unwavering. What we did wasn't just about following the rules. It was about saving a life. The hospital's policies were wrong. We couldn't just sit by and watch a man die. Another board member, Mrs. Mitchell, sighed deeply. We understand that you acted out of concern for the patient, but you've put this entire institution at risk. What happens next will have consequences, not just for you, but for everyone involved. Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee exchanged a glance. They had known this conversation was coming, but hearing it out loud made the reality of the situation all the more real. The hospital was not about to let this go. We understand, Dr. Omar said quietly, his voice firm. But we stand by our decision. If that costs us our jobs, then we'll face that. But we won't apologize for saving a life. Ms. Williams stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. We'll take this into consideration, she said coldly, signaling that the meeting was over. As the doctors left the room, they knew that whatever happened next, they had made a powerful statement. They had taken a stand, and now the fallout from their actions was just beginning. Would the hospital punish them? Would they lose everything? Or would their courage inspire a change in the way the hospital treated its staff, its policies, and most importantly, its patients? Only time would tell. The shocking revelation and the aftermath. The hospital's decision was swift. Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee had braced themselves for the worst, but when the official announcement came, they were still stunned. The board had decided to suspend them both without pay for 6 months, a penalty that sent shockwaves through the medical community. It wasn't the dismissal they had feared, but it was a punishment that would not go unnoticed. As the news spread, reactions varied. Some colleagues rallied behind Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee, praising their courage for stepping up when it mattered most. They had risked their careers for the sake of a patient's life, something the medical world valued above all else. Others, however, saw it as a cautionary tale. The hospital was sending a clear message. No one was above the rules. The media had a field day with the story. News outlets and social media platforms exploded with comments, both in support of and against the two doctors. The hashtag #SaveTheLife became a rallying cry for those who believed the doctors had done the right thing, but others argued that it set a dangerous precedent. What if doctors started disregarding hospital policies at will? But amidst all the noise, one voice stood out. A prominent journalist, Laura Simpson, who had been covering healthcare issues for years, wrote an op-ed that quickly went viral. Her piece highlighted the broader issue of institutionalized racism in the medical field and the ethical dilemmas doctors faced when hospital policies conflicted with patient care. Simpson's article had a massive impact. She described how the hospital's refusal to let Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee perform the surgery due to systemic racism had been a failure not just in medical ethics, but in humanity itself. The piece called out the hospital for putting bureaucracy before life and condemned the actions of those in charge who allowed such policies to persist. The op-ed struck a chord with many. People began questioning the practices at the hospital and demanding change. Protests outside the hospital gates grew in number, with individuals holding signs that read, "Patience over policies," and "Racism has no place in medicine." The pressure was mounting, and the hospital couldn't ignore it forever. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee received a flood of messages from people across the country. Some were patients who had suffered under similar policies, while others were fellow doctors and medical staff who expressed their support. One message stood out from a former patient who had been in a life-threatening situation herself. "I owe my life to you both," the message read. "If not for your courage, I wouldn't be here today." Despite the backlash from hospital administrators, Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee began to feel a sense of relief. They had acted according to their morals and saved a life, something they could never apologize for. Their decision had sparked a larger conversation that needed to happen, one about the ways race and policy were impacting healthcare, often to the detriment of patients. The hospital's leadership, on the other hand, began to feel the pressure. The protests outside the hospital had drawn attention from local news and the public. The media, once quick to defend the hospital's actions, now found themselves scrutinizing the practices within its walls. The board convened again, their faces grim as they realized that the issue wasn't going to disappear quietly. Several weeks later, the hospital made an unexpected announcement. In light of the growing public outcry and the pressure from civil rights organizations, they had decided to revise their policies regarding emergency surgeries. The new guidelines would ensure that race, gender, or any other personal characteristic would never again influence a decision to treat a patient. They also promised to launch an internal investigation into the incident to ensure no such discrimination would ever happen again. While Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee were still on suspension, their actions had triggered an important shift. Their brave defiance had not only saved a life, but had sparked the beginning of a movement within the medical field. More and more doctors began speaking out about the hidden biases that shaped their practices, and hospitals across the country began reviewing their policies. For Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee, the journey was far from over. They still had their suspension to serve, but their hearts were lightened by the knowledge that their actions had made a difference. They had stood up when it mattered most, and in doing so, they had shown that one voice, one decision, could change the course of an entire system. As for the young patient whose life they had saved, he recovered fully and eventually made a public statement thanking Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee for their bravery. His words struck a chord with the public. "They saved me. But they saved more than just my life. They saved a system that had forgotten its humanity." The hospital, forever marked by this scandal, was forced to reckon with its past and its future. The actions of Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee would go down in history as the catalyst for change, a moment when the medical community had to decide whether it would continue to protect its policies or place its focus squarely on saving lives, no matter the cost. For Dr. Omar and Dr. Lee, they knew one thing for sure. They had made the right choice, and as time went on, they hoped their story would inspire others to always do what was right, even when the consequences seemed too great to bear.